What you're watching right now is cockpit footage of U.S. Marine Major Thomas Brower wrestling an AV-8B Harrier II through the skies over Marine Corps Air Station Cherry Point in North Carolina. And I say wrestling because you don't really fly a Harrier. You negotiate with it. You constantly convince it that today is not the day it should violently flip over and turn you into a crater. The Marine Corps has been trying to take the Harrier behind the barn and put it out of its misery to make room for the F-35B. But before this thing completely fades into the archives of military history, we need to talk about why the Harrier is one of the most terrifying things a human being can operate, and why the Marines loved it anyway. I know exactly what the comments are going to look like. Yes, the F-35B is a flying supercomputer that can see a gnat fart from 3 states away, but hovering an F-35B is easy. A toddler could do it. You push a button, the computer takes over, the lift fan engages, and the software actively prevents you from dying. Hovering a Harrier requires you to manually balance a 30,000-pound piece of metal on 4 pillars of highly pressurized, furiously hot air using nothing but a mechanical lever, your right hand, your left hand, your feet, and sheer f***ing willpower. Flying a Harrier is like trying to balance a broom on your nose while your parents argue about their divorce in the background. It is a strictly analog nightmare, and the pilots who mastered it are absolute psychopaths in the best way possible. To understand why this plane exists, we have to go back to Britain in the late 1950s. The Cold War is peaking, and NATO military planners realize a very uncomfortable truth. If World War III kicks off, the Soviets are going to immediately nuke every single runway in Europe. If you don't have runways, you don't have an air force. So the British engineers at Hawker Siddeley, presumably after drinking several pints of warm beer, decided the solution was to build a fighter jet that didn't need a runway. It could just park in a forest, hide under some camouflage netting, and take off vertically from a supermarket parking lot. And before the Russian bots in my comments start screaming about the Yak-38 Forger, yes, the Soviets built a VTOL jet too. It was a miserable piece of shit that required 3 separate engines to hover, had the combat radius of a tetherball, and spent most of its time trying to eject its own pilots into the ocean. The Harrier actually worked. The US Marine Corps took one look at it and started foaming at the mouth. The Marines have this historical obsession with storming beaches, which is a logistical nightmare because you can't exactly bring a 10,000-foot concrete airstrip with you on a boat. The Marines wanted close air support that could launch from tiny amphibious assault ships, land in a dirt clearing right behind the front lines, rearm, and go back to dropping bombs. The Harrier was exactly the kind of unhinged problem-solving they were looking for. Most jets have an engine that sucks air in the front and blows fire out the back. The Harrier is built around the Rolls-Royce Pegasus engine, which is basically a massive turbofan sitting right in the middle of the fuselage, but instead of 1 exhaust pipe, it has 4, 2 nozzles in the front vent, cold bypass air from the massive fan, 2 nozzles in the back vent, the extremely hot combusted exhaust gases. When the pilot is flying normally, all 4 nozzles point straight back. But when Major Brower here wants to stop mid-air, he grabs a lever next to the throttle and physically rotates those 4 nozzles down. The thrust points at the ground, and the jet just stops. But here's the problem. When you are hovering at 0 airspeed, your ailerons, elevators, and rudder are completely useless. There is no air flowing over the wings to give you control. You are basically steering a shopping cart with a leaf blower. To fix this, the Harrier has a reaction control system, RCS. The engine bleeds off some of its high-pressure air and routes it through a series of tiny pipes to little puffer jets located on the nose, the tail, and the wingtips. When the pilot moves the stick while hovering, these little valves open and close, shooting jets of air to pitch, roll, and yaw the aircraft. When you hover a jet, the engine has to run at absolute maximum power while sucking in its own hot exhaust gases bouncing off the ground. This creates a massive risk of the engine literally melting its own turbine blades. So the Harrier carries a tank of 500 pounds of distilled water. When the pilot goes into a hover, they hit a switch, and the plane actively injects this water directly into the combustion chamber to cool the engine down and artificially boost thrust. You have exactly 90 seconds of water. If you don't land before the water runs out, your engine cooks itself, the thrust drops, and you fall out of the sky like an anvil. No pressure. During a vertical landing, the pilot is manipulating the stick with their right hand to stay level, adjusting the nozzles with their left hand to control forward-backward speed, tweaking the throttle with that same left hand to control altitude, and working the rudder pedals to control yaw. If you get the power curve wrong by even a fraction, the plane develops what's known as a sink rate. Because the wings aren't generating lift, if you start falling too fast, adding full power won't save you. You will just hit the ground at high speed completely upright. This is why the Harrier earned the nickname the Widowmaker back in the 80s and 90s. The Class A mishap rate, military speak for the plane exploded and/or someone died, was insanely high compared to other aircraft. Nearly a third of all Harriers the USMC bought ended up crashing at some point. It was a notoriously unforgiving airframe that actively punished you for losing focus for even a second. The Harrier proved its worth, by the way. Everyone focuses on the crashes, but in the Falklands War, British Sea Harriers went up against Argentine Mirages and completely embarrassed them. The Harriers racked up a 20-0 air-to-air kill ratio. Turns out, when you are in a dogfight and your opponent can suddenly vector his thrust to stop mid-air and force you to fly right past his guns, it kind of ruins your whole day. The Marines used them extensively in Desert Storm, Afghanistan, and Iraq, treating them like airborne artillery that just lived in the mud with the infantry. The Harrier shouldn't exist, but they did it anyway. They strapped a pilot to 23,000 pounds of vertical thrust, gave them a water tank, a nozzle lever, and basically said, "Good luck, don't melt the engine." The F-35B is safer, it's stealthier, it's objectively better at literally everything, but it will never, ever be as raw as the AV-8B. The Harrier doesn't care about software updates or sensor fusion. It cares about thrust, vectoring, and the terrifying reality of gravity. So respect the analog brick, because once the last Marine Harrier touches down for the final time, we are never getting anything this unhinged ever again. Stay safe out there, unless you're hovering a 30-year-old jet over a swamp, in which case, check your water injection gauge. See you next time.